إعلان مهم.
重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Anuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة.
为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для того, чтобы устный перевод был полным и качественным, необходимо выступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Excellencies, distinguished representatives, colleagues, I hereby declare open the 26th meeting of the 62nd session of the Human Rights Council. We will now continue with the consideration of the outcome of Australia. We will continue with the member states and observer states for their comments on the outcome of Australia. I need to remind you of the speaking time, which is 1 minute 30 seconds. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, China has taken note of Australia's UPR report and welcomes Australia's acceptance of 2 recommendations put forward by China. We regret that it did not accept the recommendations regarding the protections of rights of persons with disabilities and migrants. The Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants submitted a report entitled The Externalization of Migration Governance to the 62nd session of HRC. It once again underscores that by establishing offshore detention centers in third countries, Australia violates the human rights of migrants and asylum seekers, including children. This issue is not new, but rather the inevitable consequence of Australia's long-standing policy of externalizing migration control. China hopes that Australia will face up to its own human rights issues, including racism and xenophobia, earnestly implement recommendations made by the international community during this UPR cycle, take concrete measures to improve its own human rights situation, and make concrete contributions to the sound development of the international human rights cause. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Samoa.
Thank you, Mr. President. We express our sincere condolences to the delegation of Colombia for the passing of His Excellency, Permanent Representative Gustavo Gayon. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Samoa warmly welcomes the delegation of Australia and commends them for their efforts in preparation for the adoption of their UPR outcome this cycle. We commend Australia for the progress made in implementing recommendations from the previous cycle, particularly its commitment to an advancement of climate action. We appreciate Australia's ambitious target of reducing emissions by 62 to 70% below 2005 levels by 2035. We also wish to acknowledge and express our full support for Australia's leadership role in global climate action as the president of negotiations for COP31 later this year. We thank Australia for its support of Samoa's recommendation to strengthen inclusive education for refugees, Indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities. Samoa remains encouraged by Australia's continued engagement with the UPR process and its commitment to advancing human rights for all, and therefore recommend the adoption of Australia's report and wish them well in the implementation of their recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you. I will now give the floor to other stakeholders. That is from the list, the speakers that we can accommodate. And I will now give the floor to the other stakeholders to make their general comments on the outcome. The speaking time has been set at 2 minutes for all. And I now give the floor to the representative of Fundación Marista per la Solidarietà Internazionale ONDUS for a video intervention.
President, we welcome Australia's engagement in the UPR process and acknowledge the steps taken since the previous cycle. As the future generations of Australia, we remain committed to ensuring the current human rights needs are adequately addressed. Refugee and asylum-seeking families continue to face barriers to education, financial stability, and long-term integration. Under current laws, not all asylum seekers are allowed to work and, if eligible, receive the equivalent of €25 a day. We echo calls made by delegations for Australia to strengthen protection and support for these families, including ensuring access to inclusive education. We are also concerned about the number of young people committing crimes and the lack of programs that offer support. 85% of young perpetrators reoffend within the first 12 months of being released, demonstrating systemic weaknesses in rehabilitation. We further joined delegations in urging Australia to raise the age of criminal responsibility in line with international standards, ensuring detention remains a genuine last resort. 69% of children have been unintentionally exposed to harmful content online, reflecting the lack of measures in action to protect this vulnerable age group. We commend the efforts made by the E-Safety Commissioner in ensuring online protection, however, believe that there is more to be done in line with recommendations calling for stronger digital safeguards for children. Therefore, we urge the Australian government to 1. Implement government-funded tutoring programs for students of refugee backgrounds in English and mathematics. 2. Enact a transition program for refugees and asylum seekers in public housing that provides financial literacy aid. 3. Establish mental health programs targeted at youth offenders with a clear focus on reducing recidivism and supporting reintegration. 4. Develop structured programs that assign trained social workers to youth offenders, ensuring consistent supervision and guidance. 5. Require digital platforms to use real-time content filters and default safety settings that limit exposure to harmful content. And 6. Increase in-app opportunities to access helplines and educational resources that promote safe digital behaviors. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the representative of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches.
Thank you, Mr. President. The World Council of Churches and the National Council and we urge a more concerted effort from government. We call for a national treaty commission and truth-telling processes to aid healing and reconciliation with Indigenous communities co-designing policies and programs that affect them. We call for the minimum age of criminal responsibility to be raised on this concern, increasing crisis support funding, emergency housing and financial assistance. Climate change impacts are worsening, with rising sea levels disproportionately affecting lives and livelihoods of Aboriginal, Torres Strait and Pacific Islander communities. Integrating human rights into climate policy would aid emissions reductions and transition to renewable energy. We call for a ban on new coal mines, the phasing out of existing ones, and the transition away from fossil fuels. We thank the Republic of the Marshall Islands for their recommendation on this, and we call on the Australian We call on the government to accept the recommendation made by Kazakhstan and to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and to invest in peaceful diplomacy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of United Nations Watch.
Mr. President, Excellencies, my name is Arsen Ostrovsky. I've traveled from Sydney to speak here today, not only on behalf of UN Watch and the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, but as a survivor of anti-Semitic terror. Last November, Australia submitted its Universal Periodic Review before this council. But just weeks later, during a Hanukkah celebration on Bondi Beach, my country suffered the worst terror attack in our history. 15 people, including a 10-year-old girl, were murdered. I was at the festival with my family, but was shot in the head when I ran towards them. I speak before you today, though, not seeking sympathy, but sounding a warning that hatred directed at Jews, when ignored, excused, or mainstreamed, inevitably leads to violence. Mr. President, Excellencies, Bondi did not occur in a vacuum. It was built chant by chant and march by march. For 2 years, repeated warnings by the Jewish community went largely unheeded. Synagogues firebombed, Jewish children harassed, people afraid to wear the Star of David. Even now, teachers society like Australia, tolerance, social cohesion, the rule of law, and moral clarity. Australia has taken important steps, including establishing a Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism, which I addressed just days ago. But more, much more, must be done. I urge the international community to encourage Australia to confront anti-Semitism in all its forms, including when it masquerades as anti-Zionism, so that every citizen can live openly.
For video intervention.
Bondi Beach massacre on the 14th of December 2025, in which 16 were murdered and many more wounded while attending a Hanukkah candlelighting, was widely foreseen as the consequence of pervasive hate and anti-Semitism that flourished following the October 7th Hamas atrocities. The attack was preceded by major increases in anti-Semitic speech and violence, and by the government's failure to act, as well as its endorsement of false accusations that feed anti-Jewish hate, virulent anti-Zionism, and demonization of Israel. Already on October 9th, what was misleadingly described as a pro-Palestinian rally took place in front of the Sydney Opera House, featuring blatant hate symbols, posters, and speech. Expressions of anti-Semitism in Australia are promoted and amplified by NGOs claiming to promote human rights, as well as state-controlled media platforms and among academics. Amnesty International Australia is a primary source of demonizing language and social media campaigns through libels targeting Israel and its supporters, meaning the vast majority of the Jewish community. Systemic academic anti-Semitism, particularly at the University of Sydney, has been documented, including in a Senate inquiry. In addition, heinous hate rhetoric in Australian mosques has been documented. The establishment of the Royal Commission on Anti-Semitism and its endorsement of the international consensus definition adopted in 2016 by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance as the standard by which to assess the evidence marks a potentially important turning point. Another step is the belated government announcement that would implement the measures and recommendations that had been made in July of 2025 by the Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism. Thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of Human Rights Watch for a video intervention.
Human Rights Watch is disappointed that Australia has accepted less than half the recommendations made to it during its fourth Universal Periodic Review. In its response, Australia says it takes its human rights obligations seriously, yet it has refused to accept key recommendations to stop the incarceration of children as young as 10, to end its offshore processing regime, and to take greater action to phase out fossil fuels. Australia did acknowledge it needs to do more to address the disproportionate incarceration of First Nations children. However, this was undermined by Australia's refusal to accept recommendations to raise the age of criminal responsibility. Children as young as 10 can be incarcerated in most Australian jurisdictions. First Nations children make up just 6% of the child population, but 60% of those incarcerated. Children have been held in adult jails and locked up in conditions of solitary confinement for more than 22 hours a day. In the most serious cases, children have died in Australian detention. On migration, Australia said it was committed to ensuring its system respects the human rights of refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. Yet it did not accept recommendations explicitly calling on it to end its offshore processing regime, under which asylum seekers are forcibly transferred to the Pacific island nation of Nauru. Finally, on climate change, Australia says that it's playing a global leadership role. Yet, it accepted barely any recommendations calling for greater action, including those from Pacific neighbours who face some of the greatest threats from the climate crisis, and called on Australia to accelerate its transition away from fossil fuels. If Australia really wants to show that it takes its international human rights obligations seriously, it should reconsider its positions.
I give the floor to the representative of Christian Council International for video intervention.
Thank you. I deliver this statement on behalf of Christian Council International. While we recognise the careful considerations of Australia related to protecting religious freedom and freedom of speech in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity, we are deeply concerned about the increasing pressure on women, parents, and religious communities in Australia regarding their fundamental freedoms. More concerning, however, is the failure of the government to define biological realities. Womanhood is not a social construct nor an identity. It is a biological reality. Based on this reality, special safeguards can be attributed to our needs, rights, and aspirations. Unfortunately, these safeguards are not recognized as being valuable enough. I personally was found to have discriminated by the Federal Court of Australia based on the Sex Discrimination Act for hosting a social media space for biological women. Rather than protecting and promoting these female-only spaces, which can help women to overcome issues such as sexual harassment online, the Australian government chose not to define a biological woman, leaving sex to become a spectrum and a mere choice. We urge the Australian government to uphold biological realities on which they are now in breach of the CEDAW Convention, which grounds women's rights in biology. My dignity and that of millions of Australian women is compromised by a government that refuses to recognise concrete realities and fails to meet our unique needs. While millions are spent on promoting so-called gender equality, we call on genuine commitment towards the rights and aspirations of women. Thank you.
I give the floor to Ilga World.
Mr. President, this statement is made in consultation with Equality Australia, a civil society organisation working to protect and promote the human rights of LGBTIQ+ persons in Australia. We express our appreciation to the 8 states that raised recommendations addressing the human rights of LGBTIQ+ persons in Australia. We note with concern Australia's decision to note the recommendations specifically relating to LGBTIQ+ persons. This risks leaving persistent protection gaps unaddressed, including in relation to non-discrimination, safety, bodily autonomy, and equal participation. We encourage the government to continue engaging constructively with these recommendations, particularly given its stated commitment to dignity, participation, and equal protection before the law. While we acknowledge the government's reference to Australia's anti-discrimination framework, important gaps remain in law and practice. Religious educational institutions and service providers are still legally permitted to discriminate against LGBTQ+ people, leaving community members without equal protection, including around 1/3 of school students. We're concerned that intersex children continue to lack adequate protection from non-consensual and medically unnecessary interventions in most jurisdictions. Harmful conversion practices also remain lawful in 3 Australian states and territories. As a national LGBTIQ+ organisation, we know that most Australians would want these gaps addressed in line with equality, fairness, and inclusion. Doing so would respond directly to concerns raised during this UPR cycle. We welcome the government's acceptance of recommendations on hate speech and hate crimes. This is urgent as LGBTIQ+ Australians experience rising hate, including violent hate crimes, abuse, and discrimination. Homophobia and transphobia are increasing. We urge the Australian government to build on its commitments by taking concrete steps to ensure equal protection for all LGBTIQ+ persons across all jurisdictions. We stand ready to work constructively with the government towards this goal. Thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of the Inclusivity Project, Inc.
Madam President, caste discrimination and prejudice is persistent in Australia and is not just a case of an intercultural issue within the South Asian diaspora. It is a pervasive, systemic, and a racism problem. This finding is an outcome of extensive empirical data collected by grassroots caste-oppressed communities in Australia, as indicated in the report Caste in Australia, pointing at instances of caste-based violence, untouchability practices in the Australian society. In the landmark National Anti-Racism Framework, the Australian potential reform of existing legislation. Thereafter, the president of UNHRC adopted a favorable reading of the ground of descent under Section 9 of the Australian Federal Racial Discrimination Act of 1975 to include prohibition of discrimination against people based on caste and other forms of inherited social stratification, and began accepting federal caste-based discrimination complaints at AHRC. Yet, the discussion on addressing it remains entirely absent from federal anti-discrimination law. Without amending the list of protected characteristics to reflect an explicit ground of caste-based discrimination under the 1975 legislation. There remains a big lacuna in law which further exacerbates the human rights violations that thousands of individuals from caste-oppressed communities continue to face in Australia. Could the Australian government please suggest all steps taken and or planned towards legal regulation against caste discrimination in Australia? I thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of the Edmund Rice International Limited.
Mr. President, Edmund Rice International and partners commend the constructive participation of Australia in its fourth UPR and the progress made since its previous review. We commend Australia for supporting recommendations to build on progress to protect and promote human rights and encourage it to work towards developing a Federal Human Rights Act to ensure the protection of rights for all Australians and to prevent potential breaches. ERI commends Australia for accepting recommendations to address inequalities affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and encourage it to work towards developing a national framework for creating legislation and policies that are guided by the principles of free, prior and informed consent. We also commend Australia for its commitment to improving youth justice outcomes, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth. We encourage it to work towards raising the minimum age of criminal responsibility to at least 14 years in all Australian jurisdictions in accordance with international best practice. ERI welcomes Australia's support for recommendations to strengthen the protection of migrant workers and encourage it to ratify the relevant international convention. We also welcome Australia's acceptance of a recommendation to enhance protection for refugees and asylum seekers and reduce the reliance on immigration detention. We urge Australia to work towards the closure of offshore processing centres and to ensuring that all asylum seeker claims be processed in Australia in accordance with the Refugee Convention. Finally, we commend Australia for its commitment to the Paris Agreement and acceptance of a recommendation to pay attention to human rights in policies related to climate change. We encourage Australia to subsidise the cost of renewable energies for vulnerable groups to expedite the phasing out of fossil fuels. We also commend Australia for providing formal, permanent migration pathways for citizens of Tuvalu and Kiribati to resettle in Australia, primarily in response to the severe threats posed by climate change and rising sea levels. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Law Council of Australia for a video intervention.
The Law Council of Australia welcomes the Universal Periodic Review as an important opportunity to draw attention to urgent human rights issues and to strengthen human rights protections in our country. The Law Council's written submission highlights three priorities for Australia: the need to adopt a Federal Human Rights Act, the crisis state of the child justice system, and the continuing over-incarceration of First Nations people. We welcome the recommendations addressing these issues in the Working Group's report. However, Australia's progress in implementing similar recommendations from previous cycles has been limited. We are particularly concerned by the lack of progress to meet closing the gap outcomes for First Nations people, legislate stronger cultural heritage protections, and implement justice-related recommendations. This includes raising the minimum age of criminal responsibility and addressing the overrepresentation of First Nations children in the criminal justice system. Issues of deep concern to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in its recent alert to Australia, among others. We continue to call for Australia to fully implement and uphold its human rights obligations and standards, including under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Optional Protocol to the Convention Against Torture, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Australia's international obligations apply across all jurisdictions and cannot be deferred or diminished by the complexities of a federal system. Commitment must now lead to action. We call on the Australian Government to lead a coordinated national response to give full effect to the recommendations accepted through this process. Thank you.
Thank you. That was the last speaker that we could accommodate. Before giving the floor to the delegation of Australia for concluding remarks, allow me to inform that out of 332 recommendations received, 128 enjoyed the support of Australia and 204 are noted. And I'll give the floor back to Her Excellency, Ambassador Claire Walsh, for your concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank member states who have made statements. I would also like to thank the Australian Human Rights Commission I would like to reiterate that Australia is committed to implementing accepted recommendations and voluntary commitments, and to the continued consideration of other recommendations. We understand that the UPR does not finish today. Our ongoing work will be supported by Australia's standing national human rights mechanism. The mechanism was established as a voluntary commitment to our second UPR to strengthen Australia's reporting and engagement with the UN on human rights. It includes an Australian Government interdepartmental committee that provides a coordinated, consistent and efficient approach to human rights reporting, an intergovernmental working group consisting of representatives from the departments of the Premier or Department of the Chief Minister in every state and territory, a mechanism for consultation with the Australian Human Rights Commission and civil society, and publicly available information on Australia's human rights reporting processes. In conclusion, I wish to thank the Netherlands and Vietnam, as well as the UPR Secretariat, for their invaluable support and assistance. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Your Excellency and your delegation's presentation and the constructive participation of Australia throughout the UPR process. I now propose that the Council adopt the decision on the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of Australia as it appears on screen. I see no objection. The decision is adopted. We'll briefly suspend the meeting before the consideration of the outcome of Georgia. Thank you. We will now proceed with the consideration of the outcome of Georgia. The outcome is based on the report of the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review of Georgia and its addendum. These documents, together with the additional information that will now be provided by Georgia, will constitute the outcome of the review and shall be adopted by the Council through a standardized decision. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Revas Lominatse, Ambassador Permanent Representative of Georgia, to present additional information on the review. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, let me express my condolences on the passing of our dear friend Gustavo. It's very difficult to find the words, but our sympathies to his family, to the loved ones, and of course to his country. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, once again, on behalf of my government, I express sincere gratitude to the members of the Troika, namely Angola, Estonia, Pakistan, and the UPR Secretariat for their invaluable work. We also appreciate and value cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and its Tbilisi office, and by all means, I thank member states for their active engagement. Mr. President, one cannot underestimate the role of the HRC and its unique mechanism, the UPR, providing the opportunity for all states to present steps undertaken towards the protection and promotion of human rights at the national level. So in this vein, I would like to reiterate Georgia's continued commitment towards upholding all human rights, ensuring their better protection, and our continued support to the UPR mechanism. Ladies and gentlemen, overall 106 UN member states participated in the discussion of the report on Georgia, and 307 recommendations were given to Georgia during the review session. As a result of the internal assessment by all branches of the government, 159 recommendations were taken on board. During the next review cycle, Georgia will concentrate on addressing the recommendations in following themes. Protection of the most vulnerable groups is a key priority for the government of Georgia and will remain so for the next review cycle. Government will continue efforts aimed at elimination of violence against women and domestic violence. Further steps will be taken to protect children from sexual violence and ensure psychological rehabilitation and integration of homeless children, including children living and working on the streets. Government is also committed to the effective implementation of CRPD and its optional protocol. Government of Georgia will continue to prioritize health care and social protection, including but not limited to the further enhancing the efficiency of the universal health care program. Notably, the budget of the state program for social rehabilitation and child care is increasing every year. This increase is a clear message that the government will continue its efforts to strengthen social justice and ensure equal opportunities. To enhance the efficiency of the universal health care program, in November 2022, a new service reimbursement mechanism, the diagnosis-related grouping system, was introduced. As a result, patient co-payments for medical services decreased in 2023. The government of Georgia will continue efforts to improve the quality and equity of education at all levels, with the aim of ensuring equal opportunities for all students, including those from ethnic minorities. Now, furthermore, representatives of ethnic minorities have access to information and media in ethnic minority languages, as well as their equal and full participation in Georgia's 2020 and 2024 parliamentary elections was ensured. We all agree that the rule of law and the independence of judiciary are one of the core indicators for the application of human rights. In this regard, the most objective measure is the statistics of the European Court of Human Rights, according to which the number of complaints sent from Georgia to the court has significantly decreased in the last 15 years. In addition to the aforesaid, my government is planning to address recommendations related to the ratification of conventions, strengthening efforts to prevent and combat racism, xenophobia, and hate speech, strengthening the education and training of law enforcement officers, and mobilizing international efforts to ensure access for international mechanisms in the occupied territories, and continuing close cooperation with the international community for the safe return of internally displaced persons and refugees from their territories. Thank you, Mr. President. And at this point, I would like to yield the floor to all who wish to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now open the floor to member and observer states for their comments on the outcome of the review. The speaking time has been set at 1 minute and 30 seconds for all states. The first speaker is the distinguished representative of Brunei Darussalam.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brunei Darussalam thanks the delegation of Georgia for the update provided today on the encouraging step undertaken since review. We appreciate Georgia for its engagements with the UPR process and the careful consideration of the various recommendations put forward by delegation. We thank Georgia for accepting the 2 recommendations proposed by Brunei Darussalam related to promotions of women development and empowerment, and on maintaining and advancing initiative aimed at environmental sustainability. In this regard, we recommend adoption of the UPR Working Group report and wish Georgia every success in the implementation of the accepted recommendation. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cameroon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Cameroon would like to welcome the honourable delegation of Georgia and to congratulate them on their participation in the 4th UPR cycle, which shows its commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights. My delegation commends the acceptance by Georgia of 159 recommendations made, including those that were made by Cameroon to protect IDPs, refugees, and others in an approach which is focused on inclusivity and participation. We would support the adoption of the UPR report today, and we wish the delegation every success in the implementation of the accepted recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, the Chinese delegation commends Georgia's achievements in the promotion and protection of human rights. Georgia is working to enhance its legislation on human rights protection institutions, is focusing on economic and social development, including poverty alleviation, social protection, and protecting the rights of women, children, persons with disabilities, the elderly, and other groups, while fighting against domestic violence. It is also making greater investment in public health by strengthening universal healthcare system and cooperating with the UN human rights bodies. China appreciates Georgia's acceptance of China's recommendations and wishes it even greater achievements in the promotion and protection of human rights. We support the Council adopting Georgia's UPR outcome report. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. Costa Rica appreciates the UPR process for Georgia and the progress made, notably the national strategy for protecting human rights and measures to promote the protection of women and girls and persons with disabilities. We'd like to thank you for accepting recommendations concerning combating racial discrimination and the right to a free, clean, healthy and sustainable environment and public access to information. We encourage further measures in the areas of protective civic space and fundamental rights, and we wish you every success in implementing the recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Señor
President, we welcome the Georgian delegation and we recognise this country's commitment to the UPR mechanism. We urge Georgia to further enhance policies concerning the rights of persons with disabilities and continue implementing sound measures to strengthen the prevention and combating of human trafficking. We appreciate the inclusion of women entrepreneurs in a number of programs with a view to enhancing their economic empowerment. We appreciate the fact that Georgia accepted the 3 recommendations made by Cuba, and we wish Georgia success in implementing accepted recommendations. Cuba supports adoption of this report. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Ambassador of Georgia for his update and welcome the number of supported recommendations. We appreciate the provision of detailed explanations for the reasons behind the government's decision not to accept specific recommendations, as well as the willingness to proceed with the implementation of those that have been accepted, demonstrating the desire to ensure the advancement of protection and promotion of human rights in the country. We recognize the reasons behind Georgia's noting of recommendations made by Cyprus, and we hope that these will be reconsidered at a later stage. We support the consensual adoption of Georgia's report and wish Georgia every success in the implementation of recommendations that have been accepted. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has taken note of the UPR process and the outcome of the review of Georgia at the 51st session of the UPR Working Group. A number of states and non-governmental organizations expressed concerns about civil society, media freedom, the right to peaceful assembly, and the use of excessive force by law enforcement. These concerns were raised through the UPR process. We believe that these concerns deserve due attention from the Georgian authorities. It is important to ensure that all individuals can exercise their rights in accordance with the law and without fear. Georgia should take practical and effective measures to address these concerns and fully uphold its international human rights obligations. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Djibouti.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, President. Djibouti would like to welcome the delegation of Georgia and thanks them for their presentation, which emphasizes their efforts and engagements made to protect and promote human rights as they presented their report. Djibouti would like to commend Georgia for accepting a large number of the recommendations which were received during the 4th UPR, and in particular it commends the fact that Georgia accepted 3 recommendations that our country made. We wish every success to Georgia in the 4th UPR and implementing its recommendations, and we recommend to the Council that we adopt the report. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. The Dominican Republic congratulates Georgia on its commitment to the UPR and for having accepted most of the recommendations made. We particularly thank you for accepting the recommendations made by our country concerning pursuing the efforts to combat hate speech and hate-motivated crimes, as well as on strengthening access to high-quality inclusive education at all levels, paying particular attention to rural communities and areas. Lastly, we would like to convey our best wishes to Georgia in implementing accepted recommendations, and we encourage the Human Rights Council to adopt the report on the 4th UPR cycle by consensus. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ghana congratulates the delegation of Georgia on the successful completion of its review under the fourth cycle of the Universal Periodic Review. We commend the government of Georgia for its commitment to implementing a significant number of the recommendations received with the aim of further strengthening its legislative, judicial, and administrative frameworks to fulfill its human rights obligations. My delegation is pleased to note that all three recommendations made by Ghana were amongst the supported recommendations. In conclusion, Ghana reaffirms its support for the adoption of the UPR report of Georgia and wishes the government every success in implementing the recommendations it has received. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India warmly welcomes the delegation of Georgia for the adoption of the UPR Working Group's report on its fourth UPR, held on 26 January 2026. The review saw substantive participation with 106 delegations taking the floor and making a total of 307 recommendations. We appreciate the constructive engagement of the delegation of Georgia during the entire review, which reflects their commitment to the UPR process. India appreciates that as many as 159 recommendations have been accepted by Georgia, including all three recommendations made by us. While recommending the adoption of the UPR report, we congratulate the delegation of Georgia on a successful review and wish them success in their efforts towards implementing the accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iran.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Islamic Republic of Iran welcomes the active participation of Georgia in the UPR process. We welcome the fact that out of the 306 recommendations received during its fourth review, Georgia fully supported a significant number of recommendations, including all four recommendations put forward by the Islamic Republic of Iran. During the working group, the Islamic Republic of Iran recommended Georgia to strengthen the capacity of law enforcement to combat hate crimes and hate speech, prevent trafficking in girls for sexual exploitation, improve the quality of education, and ensure accessible and affordable community-based service for persons with disability. The Islamic Republic of Iran wishes Georgia every success in implementing the supported recommendation. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to a distinguished representative of Jordan.
السيد الرئيس يرحب وفد الأردن بوفد.
President, the delegation of Jordan would like to welcome the delegation from our brother country, which is taking part in this UPR, and we commend them for the efforts that have been made to promote and protect human rights, including the continuing ongoing reforms to strengthen the rule of law and to build capacity within human rights institutions in the country. The efforts that have been made to implement the recommendations that have already been accepted, at the previous cycle, are also commendable. We thank the country for accepting the recommendation my country made in terms of avoiding the pursuit of persecution and efforts that are being made to protect persons with disabilities. We wish Georgia every success and we recommend the adoption of this report. Thank you.
Distinguished representative of Lao PDR.
Mr. President, my delegation warmly welcomes the delegation of Georgia to this UPR adoption session and appreciate the constructive engagement of Georgia during its UPR process. The Lao PDR commends Georgia for its continuous effort to improve the quality, equality, and inclusiveness of education at all levels, aiming at ensuring equal opportunity for all students, especially vulnerable groups, without discrimination. We appreciate that Georgia has accepted the majority of recommendations received during the constructive dialogue, including 3 recommendations made by the Lao PDR. We wish Georgia every success in implementing the accepted recommendation. In conclusion, we support the adoption of the UPR outcome of Georgia by consensus. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Lithuanian recommendations to Georgia during the UPR working group meeting in January this year were made in the spirit of strengthening protection and promotion of universal human rights. Regrettably, these recommendations have not been supported. We are deeply concerned by the Georgian government's actions targeting fundamental human rights and democratic values. We must admit with regret that Georgia, once the shining star of the region and the example to follow for other countries, is now adopting repressive legislation, restricting a vibrant civil society, silencing independent media, prosecuting peaceful protesters and political opposition. These measures go against Georgia's human rights commitments on freedoms of expression, assembly and association, as well as on political equality and non-discrimination. We call on the Georgian authorities to immediately and unconditionally release all those arbitrarily detained, repeal recently enacted laws aimed at criminalizing dissent, uphold rights to freedom of assembly and expression, and end the use of force against peaceful demonstrations. I thank you.
Thank you. That was the last speaker that we could accommodate. Let me remind you that all statements, including those which could not be delivered due to time constraints, should be uploaded online. I will now give the floor to the other stakeholders to make their general comments on the outcome. The speaking time has been set at 2 minutes for all. The first speaker is the representative of Conscience and Peace Tax International, CPTI. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Conscience and Peace Tax International, CPTI, regrets that the issue of conscientious objection to military service does not appear to have been raised during Georgia's current Universal Periodic Review. While Georgia legally recognizes the right to conscientious objection, profound structural barriers remain and the provisions apply only in peacetime. Under the recently implemented Defense Code, alternative civilian services remain punitive, lasting up to 18 months. This is significantly longer than military service. Furthermore, strict 10-day application windows risk arbitrary denials, and there are no legal provisions for professional members of the armed forces who develop a conflict of conscience. We also view with concern the unequal religious exemptions that penalize non-Orthodox clergy. We call on Georgia to fully align its conscientious objection provisions with international human rights standards, ensuring that it applies at all times, including during war, general mobilization, and national emergency, and that the alternative service is genuinely civilian, accessible, and non-discriminatory in duration and practice. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Liberal International.
Thank you. Mr. President, Georgia's human rights situation in 2026 is nothing short of a catastrophe, especially considering its speed of decline in the last 18 months and now having more political prisoners per capita than Russia. It is the direct consequence of unaddressed state violence against peaceful protesters and efforts to stifle dissent with extensive, often unjustifiable draconian legislation, as well as financial suffocation of opponents. The past month have uncovered credible allegations of the use of prohibited chemical substances against peaceful protesters, and the March 2026 OSCE Moscow Mechanism report spoke of near total impunity for crimes frequently crossing the threshold of torture. Widespread unlawful and inhuman practices, such as stripping detainees naked or jailing people for merely protesting on a sidewalk, have marred this year in Georgia. A new bill will soon control social media and prosecute online dissent. As Liberal International reiterates its 2025 recommendations, it also notes that a collective political effort must be deployed by the UN to ensure compliance by the ruling power in Georgia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Equality Now for a video intervention.
Equality Now welcomes the progress that Georgia has made over the past years advancing women's rights and gender equality. including strengthening legislation on violence against women and improving institutional responses. However, since the last review, a lot of this progress has been reversed. Georgia has removed concepts of gender and gender equality from the legislation, dismantled or weakened gender equality institutions, deprioritized efforts to combat violence against women, and undermined the legal framework to address all forms of discrimination. Georgia has abolished also mandatory quotas to increase women's political participation. At the same time, Georgia has adopted severely restrictive laws targeting civil society, and key human rights organizations have been forced to suspend or significantly reduce vital services, including for women and survivors of violence. Finally, despite earlier advances, the justice response to violence against women has declined, and Georgia still lacks a consent-based definition of rape, leaving many survivors without protection. Equality Now recommends that Georgia restore the concepts of gender and gender equality in the legislation, repeal laws targeting human rights organizations, adopt a consent-based definition of rape, and strengthen the response to violence against women. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
Mr. President, FIDH and its Georgian member, Human Rights Center, welcomes recommendations issued to Georgia during its review aimed at addressing the escalating crackdown on civil society by the authorities since 2023. We are dismayed that the Georgian government has not accepted the numerous recommendations aimed at ensuring the right to freedom of association, especially those calling on the authorities to repeal the repressive law on transparency of foreign influence, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and the recent amendment to the law on grants. These laws have had a devastating effect on human rights defenders, civil society organizations, and independent media outlets, forcing most human rights organizations to severely reduce their operations, to self-censor, or to shut down entirely. As a result, thousands of individuals who previously relied on civil society organizations for legal, psychological, and other support remain in a position of extreme vulnerability. Mr. President, we note that the Georgian government supported the recommendation to strengthen measures to prevent and combat hate speech and stigmatization against human rights defenders, vulnerable groups, and civil society. Yet, at the same time, the authorities continue to target human rights defenders, including through judicial harassments and smear campaigns, portraying human rights defenders as traitors and enemies of Georgia. As of today, the bank accounts of 12 NGOs remain frozen as part of criminal investigations. The Georgian authorities also continue to obstruct the work of journalists and independent media outlets. FIDH and Human Rights Center urge the Georgian authorities to reconsider their position on noted recommendations to immediately repeal all restrictive legislations adopted since 2023 and to ensure accountability and full respect for human rights and freedom of expression and association.
I give the floor to the representative of Human Rights House Foundation.
Thank you, President. This statement is delivered on behalf of Human Rights House Foundation and Human Rights House Tbilisi. We welcome the recommendations made to Georgia during its 4th Universal Periodic Review, including the strong focus on civic space, media freedom, non-discrimination, and accountability for violations committed during protests. This focus is necessary. Since Georgia's previous review, the human rights situation has deteriorated sharply. Peaceful protesters, human rights defenders, and journalists have faced violence, intimidation, arbitrary detention, and punitive fines. Allegations of torture and ill treatment by the security services have not been met with any level of accountability. At the same time, restrictive legislation targeting civil society has proliferated. the Law on Transparency of Foreign Influence, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, amendments to the Law on Grants, and recent restrictions on assemblies and media do not strengthen democracy. They stigmatize civil society, increase state control over independent organizations, and restrict the rights of that Georgia has already committed to protect. Human Rights House Tbilisi has itself been targeted through the freezing of its bank accounts following its support to peaceful protesters facing heavy fines. This is not transparency, it is the criminalization of solidarity. We therefore recommend Georgia to 1, repeal laws and amendments restricting the rights to freedom of association, peaceful assembly, and expression. 2, end attacks, smear campaigns, and judicial harassment against civil society actors, and lift all restrictions imposed on Human Rights House Tbilisi. And 3, ensure prompt, independent, and effective investigations into all allegations of torture. Georgia can and should use this UPR outcome as a path back towards its international human rights obligations. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the ILGA representative of the ILGA world.
Mr. President, this statement is delivered in consultation with WISG, Equality Movement, and Tbilisi Pride, civil society organizations working to protect and promote the rights of LGBTI persons in Georgia. We thank the member states that made recommendations relating to LGBTI persons, including on repealing the law on the protection of family values and minors and related amendments, protection from discrimination, stigma, hate speech, and violence, and legal protection on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. We regret that Georgia noted all recommendations relating specifically to LGBTI persons. We are particularly concerned that since Georgia's last UPR review, the government has not implemented the 21 accepted SOGIESC-related recommendations. Instead, it has adopted laws and policies that restrict LGBTI expression and assemblies, ban civil partnerships, prohibit legal gender recognition, impose legal penalties related to gender-affirming healthcare, and censor LGBTI-related content in education and public life. We are also concerned that Georgia noted recommendations on civic space, fundamental freedoms, protection of journalists and human rights defenders, accountability for hate crimes, victim support, access to gender-affirming healthcare, and legal recognition of same-sex relationships. These measures have serious consequences for LGBTI communities, including self-censorship, worsening mental health, denial of healthcare, employment discrimination, censorship in academia and the media, and increased attempts to leave Georgia for safety. We urge Georgia to reconsider these recommendations, repeal discriminatory anti-LGBTI legislation, reinstate gender identity as a protected ground, investigate hate-motivated violence, guarantee fundamental freedoms, and ensure legal gender recognition and trans-specific healthcare in line with international human rights standards. Thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of Lawyers for a video intervention.
Mr. President, Lawyers for Lawyers regrets that Georgia has failed to seize this UPR as an opportunity for meaningful reform, having noted virtually every recommendation relevant to the protection of human rights defenders and lawyers, judicial independence, and fair trial guarantees. Over 30 states called on Georgia to repeal laws that devastate civic space and undermine independent legal work, including the Foreign Agent Registration Act, the Law on Transparency of Foreign Influence, the Law on Grants, and the Law on Family Values and the Protection of Minors. Georgia dismissed all of these as matters of sovereign authority, ignoring the serious chilling effect on lawyers, legal aid providers, and the clients, many of whom are left without access to effective legal representation. Georgia equally did not support any recommendations on the release of arbitrarily detained individuals and the need to investigate excessive force used against protesters, dismissing them as unsubstantiated, in direct contradiction of extensive and credible documentation by Georgian and international human rights organizations. Lawyers representing victims of torture and ill treatment by police officers regularly report procedural rights violations, including arbitrary delays in granting victim status, restrictions on access to case files, failure to preserve evidence, and misclassification of serious abuses as lesser offenses. These practices entrench impunity and deny victims any effective remedy. More broadly, lawyers in Georgia continue to face arbitrary arrests, physical abuse, smear campaigns, and restrictions on access to clients. These are not isolated incidents, but reflect a deliberate pattern of eroding the safety and independence of the legal profession, and with it, access to justice for all. Lawyers for Lawyers urges Georgia to immediately reverse course, repeal or fundamentally amend repressive legislation, release all arbitrarily detained lawyers and human rights defenders, and guarantee lawyers full and unimpeded access to their clients. Invocations of sovereignty cannot substitute for compliance with Georgia's binding international human rights obligations. Thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of International Planned Parenthood Federation for video intervention.
On behalf of the association Era 21, we welcome the government of Georgia's engagement and acceptance of recommendations on universal access to sexual and reproductive health services, maternal and neonatal health, and child marriage. Significant gaps persist. While 63.5% of married cohabiting women have a potential demand for contraception, unmet need stands at 20.3%. Currently, online climate forces healthcare providers into self-censorship, withholding information of safe legal services out of fear of digital harassment, creating an engineered information deficit. Demographically, total fertility rate fell to 1.7, driven by socioeconomic challenges and 32.5% reduction in the fertility age female population due to emigration. Crucially, child marriage remains prevalent in rural areas, 18.4%, among Azerbaijani minorities 35.4%, whose risk of marriage before age of 15 almost doubled to 1.5 in 2024. A fragmented primary healthcare system continues to hamper access in rural areas, leaving national maternal and newborn action plan objectives for youth-friendly services and integrated contraception unfulfilled. We urge Georgia to implement accepted recommendations and report progress through the voluntary midterm report. Era 21 stands ready to lend technical expertise to ensure all commitments are realized, including noted recommendations on introducing comprehensive sexuality education in and out of school settings. We call for public health policies developed with the meaningful engagement of affected populations to effectively respond to these socioeconomic and demographic challenges. Thank you.
I give the floor now to the representative of Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Civicus welcomes the government of Georgia's engagement with the UPR process. We are deeply concerned that Georgia's civic space has deteriorated sharply since the previous cycle. The Civicus Monitor downgraded Georgia from narrow to obstructed in 2024 and further to repressed, our second worst rating in December 2025. Following the mass protests of late 2024, which were met with excessive force, authorities have unleashed a wave of repressive laws and punitive measures restricting fundamental freedoms. These include immediate, harsh, and escalating penalties for common protest-related conduct, such as blocking roads and covering one's face, and sweeping restrictions on foreign funding that threaten the survival of civil society and independent media. We regret that the government has refused to accept all recommendations concerning serious allegations of torture and ill treatment of protesters by law enforcement in November and December 2024. It has also not supported recommendations calling to release political prisoners and to repeal legislation designed to restrict protests and constrain civil society and media. Civicus joins the calls urging the Georgian government to end the arbitrary arrest and criminal punishment of peaceful protesters, halt retaliation against independent civil society and media, and create an enabling environment for civil society and human rights defenders. We also urge Georgia to fully implement the recommendations of the High Commissioner's report as they relate to civic space. We thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Human Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch welcomes the many recommendations addressing Georgia's deepening human rights crisis, including those calling for the repeal of laws restricting civil society and independent media, protection of peaceful assembly, accountability for police violence, judicial independence, and a safe environment for journalists and human rights defenders. These recommendations respond to a sharp deterioration in Georgia's human rights record since 2024. In relation to civil society alone and related rights of freedom of association and expression, Georgian authorities have adopted the Transparency of Foreign Influence Law, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, restrictive amendments to the law on grants, and other measures imposing stigmatizing labels, invasive state oversight, direct government control over foreign funding, and severe criminal penalties for non-compliance. These measures have forced independent organizations to reduce or suspend activities, dismiss staff, refuse funding, self-censor, and hold essential services. Authorities have frozen the bank account of 12 civil society organizations under a sweeping criminal investigation into allegations of so-called sabotage, and demanded extensive information, including sensitive personal data concerning beneficiaries and third parties. Police have repeatedly used excessive force against largely peaceful protesters and journalists, while accountability remained absent. Peaceful protesters and government critics have faced arbitrary detention, criminal charges, heavy fines, unfair proceedings, and imprisonment. Authorities have also weakened media freedom and adopted discriminatory anti-LGBT legislation. It is therefore deeply troubling that Georgia only noted many of the recommendations addressed in the core drivers of this crisis. Georgia should reconsider its position, repeal repressive legislation, end politically motivated investigations and asset freezes, release those unjustly imprisoned for exercising their rights, ensure independent investigation into police violence, and restore a safe and enabling environment for civil society and independent media. Thank you.
Thank you. That was the last speaker that we could accommodate. Before giving the floor to the delegation of Georgia for concluding remarks, allow me to inform that out of 307 recommendations received, 159 enjoy the support of Georgia and 148 are noted. I now give the floor back to His Excellency, Ambassador Lominatse, for concluding remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. At this juncture, let me remind everyone that the situation in the occupied Georgia region remains to be dire. As a consequence of illegal occupation of Georgia's Abkhazia and Tkhinvali regions by the Russian Federation, followed by its military aggression, my government is deprived of the possibility to implement all the above measures in the occupied regions. The human rights and humanitarian situation in both occupied regions is deteriorating day by day. Violations of fundamental human rights by the occupying power in those regions include, but are not limited to, the violations of rights to life and education in native language, torture and ill treatment, arbitrary detentions, and discriminations on ethnic grounds. Now, the grave human rights situation in the occupied territories is particularly worrying given that international human rights mechanisms are denied access to those regions. Now, the Russian Federation as occupying power and the state exercising effective control bears full responsibility for human rights violations in the occupied regions, as duly attested by the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights and the International Criminal Court. Despite the ongoing occupation, the government of Georgia, in its turn, continues to address human rights violations in the occupied regions, including through raising the issue on the global level. The government of Georgia will spare no efforts and to continue implementing programs aimed at improving socioeconomic conditions of the residents from the occupied territories. Further steps are taken by the government of Georgia to address the improve socioeconomic conditions for IDPs as well, including to address their long-term housing. Nevertheless, the ultimate solution for hundreds of thousands of IDPs as well as refugees from the occupying territories of Georgia is a safe and dignified return to their places of origin. In this respect, one cannot underestimate the importance of Geneva International Discussions, GID, as it's the only format involving the Russian Federation for addressing issues related to the implementation of its international obligations under the EU-mediated ceasefire agreement of 12 August 2008, including the safe and dignified return of IDPs and refugees. Regrettably, in the Geneva international discussions, the Russian side has repeatedly avoided meaningful engagement on the return of internally displaced persons and refugees, including through staged walkouts when the issue is raised. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, despite significant security challenges through reforms implemented over the past years, Georgia is striving to strengthen the rule of law and establish higher standards of human rights protection. All these are reflected in relevant standards of human rights protection. All these are reflected in relevant international rankings. For instance, by overall score, Georgia ranks 52nd out of 143 countries globally, according to 2025 World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. Georgia will continue its efforts towards full protection and promotion of all human rights. Notwithstanding implemented measures, we are cognizant that there is much more to be done and challenges to overcome. Excellencies, to conclude, let me reiterate that Georgia considers the UPR process at the implementation of recommendations received within the framework as an important tool and guide to implement further comprehensive reforms in the field of human rights, and as a valuable opportunity for an open and constructive dialogue. At the same time, we consider it's equally important to maintain close bilateral communication with states in order to avoid any possible misinterpretation or spread of misleading information and wrong perceptions regarding the human rights situation in Georgia, which could otherwise be instrumentalized in political decision making by certain actors. Therefore, we stand ready to constructively engage in the dialogue and address the topics raised today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, His Excellency, for this presentation and for the constructive participation of Georgia throughout the UPR process. I now propose that the Council adopts the decision on the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of Georgia as it appears on screen. I see no objection. The decision is therefore adopted. We will briefly suspend the meeting before the consideration of the outcome of St. Kitts and Nevis. Thank you. We will now proceed with the consideration of the outcome of St. Kitts and Nevis. The outcome is based on the report of the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review of St. Kitts and Nevis and its addendum. These documents, together with the additional information that will now be provided by St. Kitts and Nevis, will constitute the outcome of the review and shall be adopted by the Council through a standardized decision. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Stephen Goldstein, Honorary Consul of St. Kitts and Nevis in Geneva, to present additional information on the review. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great honor for me to deliver this statement on behalf of the government of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. The Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis presented its fourth cycle UPR report during the 61st session of the Human Rights Council, held in January 26. During this session, St. Kitts and Nevis emphasized its commitment to meeting the human rights obligation, and as such, has supported most of the recommendations received. Focus was placed on matters relating to gender equality, gender-based violence, children's rights and protection, and social protection strategies, keeping in line with the country's priorities. St. Kitts and Nevis approached the review with humility, realism, and the most serious consideration and determination. Moreover, recognizing the progress achieved and the challenges ahead, the government of St. Kitts and Nevis reaffirms its dedication towards the implementation of necessary reforms and its international cooperation that supports sustainable, people-centered human rights. It would be remiss of me if I did not express gratitude to the 67 delegation that made statements during the interactive dialogue, especially to St. Kitts and Nevis Troika members, Bolivia, Ghana, and Iceland, and also to the Secretariat. St. Kitts and Nevis looks forward to the UPR adoption and to continue engaging with the international community in our endeavor to implement the recommendations and improve human rights in our land of beauty. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Excellency. I will now open the floor to members and member and observer states for their comments on the outcome of the review. The speaking time has been set at 1 minute and 30 seconds for all states. The first speaker is the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Thank you, President. Costa Rica appreciates the outcome of St. Kitts and Nevis's UPR, and we see that there is constructive engagement in the large number of recommendations accepted. We'd like to praise St. Kitts and Nevis on ratifying the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, also promoting gender equality and social protection, as well as programs to empower young people, seniors and persons with disabilities. We see that you have also been strengthening the right to clean, healthy and sustainable environment, as well as further social protection. We wish you every success in implementing accepted recommendations and offer our support to you in this endeavour. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Señor Presidente.
President, we bid a cordial welcome to the Kitts and Nevis delegation, and we see that this country remains committed to the UPR process and that there is political will to further the cause of human rights. We also appreciate the fact that St. Kitts and Nevis accepted the 3 respectful and constructive recommendations made by Cuba. We acknowledge the country's constant efforts to implement the family health plan, which would allow universal access to primary health care. We'd also like to underscore the progress made in implementing the National Policy and Plan of Action Social Protection for the period up to 2030 and the planning framework for national development. We wish St. Kitts and Nevis every success in implementing accepted recommendations, and we support the adoption of this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis for its presentation and welcome the decision by the government to accept a large number of recommendations received, demonstrating their commitment to advancing the promotion and protection of human rights, despite numerous difficulties arising from climate change and rising sea levels. We're happy to note that the recommendations made by Cyprus pertaining to the development of comprehensive strategies to tackle youth gang violence, the use of firearms and drug-related crimes among adolescents, as well as the amendment to legislation to criminalize all forms of gender-based violence have been accepted. At the same time, we hope that noted recommendations will be reconsidered at a later date. We recommend the adoption of St. Kitts and Nevis report by consensus and wish every success in the implementation of the recommendations that have been accepted. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Dominica.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dominica welcomes the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis, a fellow CARICOM and OECS member state, and commends the delegation for its constructive engagement throughout the UPR process. We take positive note that St. Kitts and Nevis has pledged support for the majority of recommendations received, including 2 recommendations made by Dominica. As a fellow small island developing state confronted with multifaceted challenges that threaten development gains and the enjoyment of human rights, we acknowledge and laud St. Kitts and Nevis's continued commitment and ongoing efforts to advance the promotion and protection of human rights in face of these adversities. Dominica fully supports the adoption of the UPR outcome of St. Kitts and Nevis and extends best wishes in the implementation of accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Dominican Republic.
Gracias. Thank you, President. The Dominican Republic offers its congratulations to St. Kitts and Nevis on its commitment with the UPR and for having accepted most of the recommendations made. We particularly appreciate your acceptance of the recommendations made by our country concerning establishing an independent national human rights institution and removing any exceptions in the law which would allow young people to marry before they reach 18, to complete the review of the national disability policy and work towards holistic legislation in this area, and also strengthening the programs for the empowerment of youth, seniors and persons with disabilities. Lastly, we wish St. Kitts and Nevis every success in implementing accepted recommendations, and we encourage the Human Rights Council to adopt the outcome report of the 4th cycle of the UPR by consensus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of El Salvador.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, President. El Salvador congratulates St. Kitts and Nevis on accepting a large number of recommendations during the 4th cycle of the UPR. We appreciate the constructive spirit that St. Kitts and Nevis showed during this process, and we also appreciate the additional information presented today. We thank you for accepting the 2 recommendations from our delegation, and we hope that their implementation will help you challenge immediate challenges such as reducing violence and eradicating poverty. Lastly, we wish St. Kitts and Nevis every success and support adoption of this report. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ghana congratulates the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis on the successful completion of its review under the 4th cycle of the UPR. Ghana commends the government of St. Kitts and Nevis for its commitment to implementing a substantial number of the recommendations received with the aim of further strengthening its legislative, judicial, and administrative frameworks to enhance compliance with its international human rights obligations. Ghana is pleased to have served as a member of the Troika for this UPR and express our confidence in the institutions of St. Kitts and Nevis to continue advancing the promotion and protection of human rights at both the international and national levels. In conclusion, Ghana reaffirms its solidarity with and support for St. Kitts and Nevis and wishes the government every success in the implementation of accepted recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Haiti.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, the delegation of Haiti would like to welcome the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis during the adoption of the report of its fourth UPR. My delegation commends the progress that's been made, in particular, the ratification of the International Covenant on Civic and Political Rights, as well as the establishment of a ministry on the empowerment of young people for aging and for persons with disabilities. We also commend the adoption of a national policy for social protection for 2025 to 2030, and the strengthening of the legislative framework on domestic violence. We encourage St. Kitts and Nevis to continue reforms to protect vulnerable groups, ensure gender equality, and to fight against criminality. We strongly recommend the adoption of the outcome report, and we wish the country every success.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Mr. President, India warmly welcomes the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis for the adoption of the UPR Working Group's report on its fourth UPR, held on 27 January 2026. The review saw substantive participation, with 67 delegations taking the floor and making a total of 190 recommendations. We appreciate the constructive engagement of the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis during the entire review, which reflects their commitment to the UPR process. India appreciates that St. Kitts and Nevis has accepted majority of the recommendations, including all 3 recommendations made by us. By recommending the adoption of their UPR report, we congratulate the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis on a successful review and wish them success in their efforts towards implementing the accepted recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iran.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Islamic Republic of Iran welcomes the active participation of St. Kitts and Nevis in the UPR process. We welcome the fact that out of the 119 recommendations received during its fourth review, St. Kitts and Nevis fully supported a significant number of recommendations, including all 3 recommendations put forward by Iran. During the working group, Islamic Republic of Iran recommended St. Kitts and Nevis to strengthen access to justice and the protection of fundamental rights, address the human rights impact of climate change, and enhance protection for women and children against violence and exploitation. The Islamic Republic of Iran wishes St. Kitts and Nevis every success in implementing the supported recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jamaica.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation commends the government of St. Kitts and Nevis for its constructive engagement with the UPR process. We recall with appreciation the achievements reported by St. Kitts and Nevis during its review, including the establishment of the Ministry of Youth, Empowerment, Aging and Disabilities, the development of the National Social Protection Policy and Action Plan 2025 to 2030, and the continued efforts to strengthen legislative frameworks related to criminal justice and child protection. We encourage the full implementation of the recommendations emanating from this process that enjoy the support of the government to advance these efforts. Jamaica, as a small island developing state, recognizes the real capacity constraints on smaller delegations. For this reason, Jamaica reiterates its recommendation 134.45 for the continued strengthening of national implementation mechanisms to support effective follow-up to UPR recommendations and the active pursuit of technical assistance to this end. In closing, my delegation supports the adoption of the UPR outcome for St. Kitts and Nevis. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kiribati.
Thank you, Mr. President. Kiribati welcomes the adoption of the Universal Periodic Review outcome of St. Kitts and Nevis and thanks the delegation for its constructive engagement throughout the process. We commend St. Kitts and Nevis for its continued efforts to strengthen human rights, including through social protection reforms, the promotion of gender equality, and its sustainable island state agenda. As a fellow SIDS, we appreciate St. Kitts and Nevis's support for 2 of our recommendations. While we note that our recommendation to remove all exceptions permitting marriage under the age of 18 was not supported, we encourage continued dialogue and efforts to strengthen the protection of children's rights in line with international standards. We wish St. Kitts and Nevis every success in implementing the recommendations it has accepted. We thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lesotho. Then I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Maldives warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation from St. Kitts and Nevis to the adoption of the UPR report and compliments St. Kitts and Nevis on its commitment to the UPR process. The Maldives commends St. Kitts and Nevis for accepting the majority of the recommendations it received during the UPR working group session in January 2026, including both recommendations by the Maldives. We wish the government of St. Kitts and Nevis success in implementing the accepted recommendations and request the Council adopt the UPR outcome report for St. Kitts and Nevis by consensus. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Morocco.
Mr. President, the delegation of Morocco welcomes the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis and is pleased to support the adoption of its UPR report today. We congratulate St. Kitts and Nevis for its constructive participation in the interactive dialogue and for the notable progress made in aligning its national legislation with the international standards, particularly regarding child protection and the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. The voluntary acceptance of the formulated recommendation illustrates the vitality of its commitment of human rights values. Morocco expresses its full support to St. Kitts and Nevis in its implementation phase. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Nepal warmly welcomes the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis to the adoption of the UPR outcome and thanks them for their constructive engagements with the human rights mechanisms. We thank St. Kitts and Nevis for accepting 1 out of 3 recommendations that we offered. We take note of the progress made by St. Kitts and Nevis in the protection of women and children through legislative measures. Nepal wishes St. Kitts and Nevis all success in implementing the accepted recommendations and supports the adoption of the UPR outcome report. I thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker that we could accommodate. Let me remind you that all statements, including those which could not be delivered due to time constraints, should be uploaded online. I will now give the floor to the other stakeholders to make their general comments on the outcome. The speaking time has been set at 2 minutes for all, and the first speaker is the representative of Advocates for Human Rights for Video Intervention.
Mr. President, the Advocates for Human Rights, a member of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, thanks the member states that made a total of 21 recommendations during the January interactive dialogue urging St. Kitts and Nevis to take steps towards formal abolition of the death penalty. We are disappointed that St. Kitts and Nevis has made no substantive progress towards abolition of the death penalty since its 3rd cycle UPR. St. Kitts and Nevis merely continues to assert that it will continue to examine the death penalty within the context of international law, judicial interpretation, and evolving international human rights standards. Yet we see no concrete evidence of any sincere examination, much less concrete action. In this regard, we want to amplify Costa Rica's recommendation that St. Kitts and Nevis take measures to promote public debate on alternatives to the death penalty, an important first step that would demonstrate that authorities are open to building the foundation for eventual abolition. We are pleased that St. Kitts and Nevis has maintained a de facto moratorium on executions since 2008, but the lack of a de jure moratorium leaves the door open for authorities to resume executions at any time. We therefore call on St. Kitts and Nevis to institute a formal moratorium as an interim step to take concrete strides towards abolition of the death penalty and ratification of the ICCPR and its 2nd optional protocol. We are also disappointed that St. Kitts and Nevis lacks formal anti-discrimination protections for LGBTIQ+ people. We commend the Supreme Court's 2022 decision to decriminalize consensual same-sex relations, but authorities have not yet implemented constitutional or legislative protections for LGBTIQ+ people. We encourage St. Kitts and Nevis to create legislative frameworks that better protect LGBTIQ+ individuals by including LGBTIQ+ groups and protected groups within discrimination legislation. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the representative of Christian Council International for video intervention.
Thank you. I deliver this statement on behalf of Christian Council International. We commend the government of St. Christopher and Nevis, also known as St. Kitts and Nevis, for its continued engagement with the UPR process. In light of the proposed recommendations, we wish to highlight 3 issues based on the religious and cultural values of St. Kitts and Nevis. First, several recommendations were issued focused on strengthening sexual and reproductive health services within the legislative framework. We wish to recall that sexual and reproductive health has no universal agreed upon definition and that there is no binding international obligation on St. Kitts and Nevis to legalize abortion. International consensus affirms that abortion should in no case be promoted as a method of family planning and that foreign pressure to liberalize and legalize abortion laws should be dismissed. Likewise, comprehensive sexual education is also not defined in any legally binding international instrument. States, therefore, retain the right to adopt other value-based educational approaches, such as abstinence-focused sexuality education in line with parent oversight and religious values. Third, several calls were made to the government of St. Kitts and Nevis to legalize same-sex unions. International law does not impose a binding obligation to legalize such unions. States therefore retain the right to regulate marriage and family life in accordance with their public morals, cultural values, and religious traditions, while at the same time ensuring that all individuals are protected from violence and unjust discrimination. We wish you God's blessings in further deliberations and thank you for the opportunity to share on behalf of the people of the Federation of St. Christopher and Nevis. God bless.
I give now the floor to the representative of Center for Global Non-Killing.
Beloved human beings, Mr. President, dear populations of St. Kitts and Nevis, dear delegation, dear authorities of St. Kitts and Nevis, including the highest, everyone, everywhere, greetings of lively human rights. Dear human beings, truly, I'm fond of St. Kitts. It bears my name, Christopher. I was there long ago. Good remembrance. However, if I was to live there, I'm not sure my life would be well honored and protected. If I was to attempt suicide, I could be punished for it, thus diminishing the odds of missing myself by fear of punishment. This criminalization may make suicides more deadly. As asked in our written submission, dear St. Kitts and Nevis, please repeal Article 136 of your criminal code. If I was to be condemned for a most serious crime, the situation is improving, but until legal change is fully made, I would still risk a death sentence. If I wanted to change the Constitution to celebrate life therein instead of death penalty, I would have no initiative rights, and I could only do it if the Parliament called for a referendum. May it do so, nevertheless. If anywhere in the world I was caught in a genocide, I would not get St. Kitts protection, as this state has not ratified the Convention on Genocide and has noted a recommendation made by Armenia. Finally, St. Kitts has the unique future of being a country who established a defense force, then it abolished it, and then reestablished it again. These small-called defense forces are needed for climate issues, prevention, and resilience, while call them armies, while they are civilian protection forces. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Just Atonement, Inc. for video intervention.
Thank you, distinguished President and members of the Council. Just Atonement, Inc. commends St. Kitts and Nevis for its proactive approach to addressing climate change, including the 2024 passage of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center bill and the recent initiative to create a roadmap to reach 100% renewable electricity generation. St. Kitts and Nevis faces a variety of challenges from climate change, and we applaud its comprehensive efforts. We suggest that St. Kitts and Nevis studies risks of extreme heat on the islands and considers treating heat waves as a slow onset disaster akin to sea level rise. We want to emphasize several actions and add a few recommendations. First, we applaud St. Kitts and Nevis for its commitment to sustainable agriculture and stress the importance of local knowledge, as reflected in a recent report on transforming food systems by the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. Second, we endorse St. Kitts and Nevis's climate efforts and urge it to pursue the climate funding due to it from other states under applicable human rights and international environmental law. Lastly, we echo the United Nations countries team's recommendation that St. Kitts and Nevis consider issuing a standing invitation to special procedure mandate holders. As climate change threatens human rights, we also urge St. Kitts and Nevis to acknowledge and address disparities caused and worsened by climate change, including gender disparities, and to consider ratification of outstanding human rights treaties and optional protocols. We emphasize the need to recognize human rights and justice when planning climate action. We thank St. Kitts and Nevis for its commitment to addressing climate change.
I give the floor to the representative of Shaanxi Patriotic Volunteer Association for video intervention.
Mr. President, fellow delegates, I represent the International Patriotic Pact organization composed of 300 NGOs from 68 countries. We advocate loving one's own country without harming other countries' interests. We highly commend St. Kitts and Nevis for its achievements in implementing the recommendations from a previous round of UPR. Regarding the challenges in the justice system and protection of vulnerable groups raised in the review, we believe that a true patriotism means facing issues squarely and seeking cooperation. However, addressing these issues' internal challenges cannot be separated from a peaceful and stable external environment. The concept of our pact and the National Development Rights Review mechanism proposed by our organization aim to resist unilateral sanctions and external interference and protect national rights to development for all countries. This provides a systemic guarantee for countries to resolutely resolve their internal issues. Your country's sustainable island state agenda aligns with this philosophy. We call on the Council and the international community, especially developing countries, to actively participate in the International Patriotic Pact and the National Development Review mechanism. Together, we can resist unilateral sanctions and achieve national development. Here, I invite all of you to attend our autumn forum scheduled for the 21st of September at the UN office in Nairobi. Let us explore together how to unite patriotic forces to reshape a new international order of peace to contribute to building a community of a shared future for mankind. Thank you, sir.
I give the floor to the representative of Imam Ali's Popular Student Relief Society for video intervention.
Thank you. St. Kitts and Nevis remains the only state under Item 6 whose UPR addendum was published only one day before its adoption, significantly limiting stakeholders' opportunity to examine the decisions in depth. We welcome its accession to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 2024 and encourage the government to accede without delay to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights together with its optional protocols. We are concerned that, as in the previous UPR cycle, St. Kitts and Nevis again declined recommendations calling for the abolition of the death penalty or at least a formal moratorium, while no execution has taken place for 18 years and there are currently no prisoners on death row. The continued existence of capital punishment in law remains a matter of concern. We therefore urge the authorities to refrain from imposing any new death sentences and to take concrete steps toward abolition. Finally, we remain concerned about prison overcrowding and poor sanitary conditions. We encourage the government to reduce excessive pre-trial detentions and make greater use of appropriate early release measures in order to improve detention conditions and better comply with the international human rights standards. Thank you.
This was the last speaker on my list. Before concluding, allow me to inform that out of 190 recommendations received, 104 enjoyed the support of St. Kitts and Nevis, and 84 are noted. Additional clarification was provided on another 2 recommendations, indicating which parts of the recommendations were supported and which parts were noted. I thank the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis for the presentation and the constructive participation throughout the UPR process. I now propose that the Council adopt the decision on the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of St. Kitts and Nevis as it appears on screen. I see no objection, and therefore the decision is adopted. We will briefly suspend the meeting before the consideration of the outcome of Sao Tome and Principe. Thank you.
Thank you.